You are not going to like the words that come out of my mouth on this podcast. But here we are, delivering day after day after day, and the Minnesota Vikings season is right around the corner. This upcoming Sunday, the Minnesota Vikings face off versus the New York Football Giants for the season opener. It's all hope. It's all excitement right now for every single NFL football team, especially in the NFC North, where you got the Caleb Williams Chicago Bears, the Jordan Love Green Bay Packers, the Detroit Lions, who almost made it to the Super Bowl last year, and the revamped Minnesota Vikings that are trying to shock the world this season and maybe even make a wild card berth with Sam Darnold as he tries to resurrect his career for the Minnesota Vikings. This Thursday, Kansas City Chiefs versus Baltimore Ravens. It's all happening this week, and it's a very exciting week. But as I mentioned, you are not going to like the words that come out of my mouth on this podcast, but I've got to share my opinion and my honest take, which I don't even think is controversial, maybe a little, but I don't really think so. I think my takes are honestly mostly common sense, and people that don't agree with them, I mean, sometimes I kind of go out on a limb a little bit, be a little spicy, a little bit of that, but for the most part, my takes are common sense takes. And when I think about the recipe for the Minnesota Vikings this season, when you look at the roster, offensively, defensively, special teams, who really looks at special teams, but you look at the two core areas, offense and defense. The Minnesota Vikings defense is so much better than it was last season, at least on paper. Last year, Brian Flores, all he could really do to manipulate opposing offensive coordinators was blitz the living piss out of them. That was the only chance that he had because the Minnesota Vikings defense was so weak. And the only chance they had to do anything was to make the quarterback throw it early because the Minnesota Vikings defense could not cover anybody. They could not cover anybody. So that's why they blitzed so much last year. But because they have more talent defensively this year, think about Shaq Griffin, Stephon Gilmore, Greenard, Cashman, Van Winkle. I mean, those are 5 new starting defenders right there out of 11. And you hope Ivan Pace Jr. takes another step. The rookie that they drafted, was that Levi Rodriguez, was a beast in preseason. So you would think that with the players that I just listed right there, the Minnesota Vikings would be far and beyond better than last season. The offense, Sam Darnold trying to create a new career path really for himself. This is his season. If he plays well this year, well, the Minnesota Vikings will have a good season. And if he plays well this year, well, his career will extend beyond this season, and there could be a team that comes calling for his name next offseason and signs him to a 2 to 3 year contract worth quite a bit of money. If he plays well this season, a team next year could think that he's going to be the missing link to their team, and he could sign a big contract this offseason or next offseason to continue his NFL dream of being an NFL starting quarterback. But this is what I think is true. The margins in the NFL are already really slim. There's a lot of close games throughout the NFL. But the margins for the Minnesota Vikings to be successful are going to be so slim. It's going to be so difficult for them to have a successful season. I think about a few years ago when the Minnesota Vikings went 13-4 under Kevin O'Connell, and they went 11-0 in one-score games during the regular season. I came up and asked KJ Osborne. He came on the podcast, and I said, "Is that can you replicate that season? Like, can that happen again? And he's like, well, besides the Buffalo Bills game, yes, I think we can. And no, you're not going to replicate 11-0 in one-score games probably ever again. The chances that happened in the first place was so small and so crazy. And I think that's going to, have to be what it takes for the Minnesota Vikings to have another successful season this year. I don't think they have to be 11-0 in one-score games, but they're probably going to have to be like 9-2, 10-1 in one-score games. Because here's the problem with the Minnesota Vikings this season. They're not going to win shootouts offensively. They're not going to win games 42-35, 35-28. They're not going to win 31-27. The Minnesota Vikings, in order for them to have a successful season, the defense is going to have to play lights out. They're going to have a top 10, top 15 defense. And they're going to have to win games like 21-17, 17-14. And when you win games like that, the margin for error is so slim. But I think that's the recipe for the Minnesota Vikings season this year in order for them to be successful. Sam Darnold isn't going to be thrown for 400 yards and 3 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. That's just not the type of quarterback that Kevin O'Connell is going to ask him to be. You hope that he goes out there and throws for like 170, maybe eclipses 200, throws for 2 touchdowns and 0 interceptions, and is like 17 for 22. I don't think the goal is for Sam Darnold to be throwing the ball 40 times a game. That is not the recipe for the Minnesota Vikings this season. Aaron Jones needs to play out of his mind. And stay healthy. The Minnesota Vikings defense needs to take a major step forward. And Sam Darnold needs to do something that he's never, ever done in his NFL career. And that's be an efficient and effective quarterback. A guy that doesn't throw interceptions. A guy that doesn't take too many risks. And in order for a quarterback to win games like that, the defense also needs to perform well. This isn't a situation where, and I don't know the Buffalo Bills defense, but you got Josh Allen offensively, so, there can be some holes in other areas of the Buffalo Bills defense or the Kansas City Chiefs defense. Because you got Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen. There's margin for error in other areas of your team because of the quarterbacks that they have on their roster. There's no room for that on the Minnesota Vikings. They need to have a perfect season, or obviously not a perfect season, but you know what I mean. They need to have a season that is so filled with consistency, routine, unforced errors. They cannot have unforced errors. They cannot fumble the ball like they did last year, or the season's over in week 2. They cannot have all these turnovers because they don't have the offense or defense to overcome that. So that's why I think it's going to be so difficult for the Minnesota Vikings to make the playoffs this year, because the margin for error is so slim. They don't have a roster with an all-star quarterback, and they don't have a top 3 defense that can carry them to the playoffs. They both need to do their part, and I just think that's going to be very difficult for the Minnesota Vikings to do this year. Now, I don't think that a wild card spot is completely ruled out, but the NFC North is. I don't think the Vikings have any chance to win the division this year. But the goal is a wild card spot. Can they get to 9 wins and sneak in? They'll need a lot of luck. They'll need a lot of help from other teams. Can they get to 10 and find themselves in an area where not many at all predicted them to be this year? Maybe. But what that's going to take is clean football, a lot of luck, a lot of one-score victories, similar to the 11-0 season that they had, and then they lost to the Giants and went 11-1 in the playoffs. Crazy. But I just think it's going to take a lot of that. And that's the recipe for Kevin O'Connell, Sam Darnold, Justin Jefferson, and the Minnesota Vikings defense, or Minnesota Vikings team this season.